How much is AI helping us optimize lifespan and health span of dogs?
We are increasingly close to being able to unlock a lot of the historical medical information that has been generated by the veterinary profession. As there's more connections to historical data, as we have more information from pet owners directly, whether it's your pet cameras or your wearable devices or your food bowls, as those become online, we're in a position to be able to unlock different sorts of care models that frankly are largely incompatible with the way that veterinary care exists today. Can we use technology to really support the human-animal bond? You ain't seen nothing yet.
Welcome to the Dog Longevity Project. I'm your host, Dr. David Haworth. I'm a veterinarian with a PhD in physiology and a real passion for the bond that we have with our pets. With this podcast, I'm talking with some of the brightest minds in the field about ways pet owners can help their pets live the longest, fullest life possible. This podcast is brought to you by Panio, a platform designed to bring together all the information you have about your pet, diet, lifestyle, genetics, health data, and then help you take steps to keep your pet healthier longer. And today we're going to be talking with one of my favorite people in the world, Dr. Adam Little, who is a brilliant veterinarian, very into AI and all the different ways that the world can work as we go forward. So, Adam, welcome.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be on that.
So let's start like we started all these podcasts. People don't generally know you right off the top of your head. So why don't you give them a little bit of your story?
Yeah, basically it's a series of strange one-off decisions that have created a bit of an interesting journey. So as you mentioned, I went to veterinary school at the Ontario Veterinary College, so just up in Guelph, Canada. I intended to be a practicing veterinarian. I was really interested in oncology, really interested in neurology. And at the end of my first year, I kind of had an opportunity to choose between two projects. I got accepted into Veterinarians Without Borders, where I would go somewhere in the world, didn't know at the time, to kind of do a development project there, or take a summer research project with the neurology department. And I remember actually going to the dean of research at the time, sort of explaining with cellular coverage maps how I could do both. I was like, look, I'm actually going to go to Tanzania, but the place that I'm going looks like it has cell coverage, so I can do the project remotely. And he was basically like, I don't know what to do with this kid. Like, clearly you can't. This is an in-person summer job you're going to have to choose. And I think correctly, in that case, I ended up choosing Tanzania. The next kind of big thing was when I was in East Africa there, it was really eye-opening to see the different roles that veterinarians were playing in society, kind of this broader public health approach. And so I was doing some work focused on poultry. And then in the evening, I was sort of looking and digging into that research. And it was around that time, there was, for me, a really influential paper called the Bear Animal Usage Study. And it looked at, among other things, the impact that the internet was beginning to have on people's relationship with their pets and how that was manifesting within some kind of veterinary industry data. And so that spurred sort of this interest in, hey, can we use technology to really support the human-animal bond? And I started working on a project called Pet Connect, which was a really early mobile pet app that I started to shop around saying we can build technology to connect and manage people's relationship with their pets.
And what year is this, Adam?
This is like 2009, 2010.
Okay, cool. So smartphones existed, but they were pretty...
Yeah, exactly. And it was kind of what ended up being kind of the first wave of a lot of these initial pet owner communication solutions. I work with a company called LifeLearn in Guelph when I started after vet school, spent some time out in Silicon Valley just before that, looking at kind of emerging technologies and sort of bringing some of those perspectives back to the veterinary space. And at that time, it was I kind of assumed, I'm like, I'll find other people in the profession who are really looking deeply at these emerging technologies, because over the next kind of couple decades, it's going to fundamentally transform our profession. And I have to say, it was a pretty, small table, really sparse kind of lunch table. I was kind of this weird kid in the corner. And I think maybe over time, some of the ideas and thinking and just areas I was interested in have now kind of caught up to the moment. So, LifeLearn kind of gave me my start there, and then we can talk further, but I've spent my career at the intersection there.
Can I pull you back just 1 second? Because I think you were referring to Singularity University. And you and I have spoken in the past, but our listeners obviously haven't been privy to those conversations. I mean, that was a that was not just hey, I spent a little time in Silicon Valley kind of looking at new tech. I mean, that was a sea change and really some very innovative thinking. And you were, to my understanding, the very first veterinarian that went through those kind of ritualized programs, and then you brought them back to the veterinary professions. Could you just talk a little bit more about what that experience was?
So maybe like kind of practically speaking, it was a 10-week program with 80 students, kind of graduate students, but the reality is they were from all kind of different points in their career, from 40 different countries that were immersed and actually lived at NASA, at the NASA Ames Research Campus. And it was a program that was initially, co-founded and supported by some of the Google folks, but Peter Diamandis and Ray Kurzweil were kind of the chairman of it. And it's the best way to explain it is it's like summer camp for futurists. And so you spend a good portion of the time, meeting with and learning from these really kind of high octane leaders in their industries, none of which were veterinary medicine, some of which were human health, and then working on a project that has the potential to impact 1 billion people within 10 years. That's kind of like the mantra. So they really kind of push you to think of ideas, and ideally companies that have a really transformative impact. And like one of the quotes that kind of came back a lot in the formation of that program was Larry Page, one of the co-founders of Google, sort of said that, what is it, like more like 99.999% of people in their day-to-day lives like aren't trying to change the world. That's not what they want to do. And so the idea is to try to foster, like identify, foster, and kind of amplify those people that really want to make a dent on the world. And so it was an incredible opportunity. I felt very grateful to be there. Felt like a huge fish out of water. I didn't really suffer that much imposter syndrome throughout most of like going into vet school and things, because I felt like I'd worked really hard. I knew that I could do it. I felt like it was a place to be. But I mean, one of my classmates, and it just so happens that he had the same birthday as me. He was a PhD in like string theory. He had done, defense work with the European Space Agency, and he was like a published science fiction author. And I'm like, this is the guy that's like appeared in the class. I'm like, okay, I officially have imposter syndrome. But it was just this kind of constructive, optimistic builder mentality about, hey, we have access to these capabilities that are so much more advanced than anybody's ever had in human history. Like, what can we build with them to make a meaningful, positive difference? I think that's probably been the thread that has continued on with my entire career. And I think for me, being able to apply that to a very specific vertical niche where you have the relationships and the alignment and the passion has been like a really unique and kind of powerful recipe.
Well, I mean, let me just pull on that thread just a little bit, because the whole reason that I like asking people about their story to begin with, because I think people's lives go through these experiences and you sometimes find out what normal is. And I think in Singularity University for you, and actually, by reflection, a number of the rest of us got this idea of there are really amazing people out there whose vision and mission is to change the world for the better. And we're trying to utilize these new technologies that are coming on, which are extraordinarily powerful in ways that we're not even sure about. In 2009, 2010, we were even less sure about how powerful they were than we are now. And of course, it continues to ramp up that way. But you really saw a different way of seeing normal, and were able to translate through the lens of veterinary medicine and get you. I can remember the very first time I started hearing you talk was around like, oh, wow. Like, these are not insurmountable problems. You're not looking for another treatment for cranial cruciate ligament. We're trying to say, how do we expand and build upon this incredible bond that people have with their pets? And so I'm filling in parts of your story, but that to me was sort of where your voice is both unique and also extraordinarily exciting in this space. I guess maybe that leads me to the question to you, which is, do you consider yourself a futurist?
I don't like that label, but I do think I'm somebody who thinks a lot about the future. Maybe the biggest difference is like for most of I tend to look at problems or opportunities as like what is the art of the possible? And I think for a lot of these problems that veterinary medicine face, people that think they're kind of like existential issues, I just think that there's opportunities to reimagine the entire system. And I think when you kind of zoom out, one of the reasons I'm so optimistic about the veterinary profession is that we've always had to reinvent ourselves. Like people's relationship with pets and animals more broadly has changed to the point that we would look back now at the way that veterinarians acted and the way that we practiced, 100 years ago and be like, that's illegal, right? Like I can't, like if that veterinarian walked in to get a job, you'd have him arrested. And so I think that there's something really important about a profession that has such a diversity of skill sets, is working in an area that's so important to society, has such broad applications, has so much sort of unmet potential too, in terms of like the number of pets that are out there, and the number of animals that need help, and the degree and depth of care that can be provided. That's really important. And I think that's where the longevity piece really fits. It's that I think this could end up becoming like a really defining arc or lens on how we look at the future of veterinary medicine, because it just makes a lot of sense. And I think we already see a lot of breadcrumbs of that today in terms of why that's going to become increasingly important. And so it's one of the reasons I'm incredibly optimistic about it, but also one of the reasons I think people within the profession need to have that bold thinking and amplify it, because otherwise we are not going to be part of creating that conversation. And worse yet, we could actually inhibit the real growth of animal and pet care.
One of the reasons I have sort of pivoted much of my thinking into the longevity question is not because I think we want Methuselah dogs that live forever. I think it's because we have always, as pet lovers, but also people who've dedicated their lives to the healing of pets, have always believed that quality of life is paramount. So, we have a lot of friends in the human health field who are just now, it seems, starting to pivot to that recognition that, maybe I can keep them alive, but that's no way to live. And who gets to make those decisions, and how do you create the thought structures around quality of life? And so when we start from a veterinary standpoint or an animal standpoint, the longevity question, it really boils down to how do you keep the quality of life as high as possible for as long as possible before the inevitable happens and we have to end it. It also, and this is maybe an aside, but I think you're going to probably want to get back to it. There's a lot of longevity questions in the human sphere that are just not applicable in pets. So, for instance, the virtual reality where, I'm going to upload my entire existence to the cloud, and I'm going to somehow live beyond my body, this extra corporeal kind of existence. I maybe my golden retrievers would like to do that, but it's.
We'll just clone them instead. Like that's I think the analog of that, where it's like, okay, we need to preserve this pet. Like I think you do see a part of the population that's like, again, that's come from like science fiction. Like people do that.
I think what you find out is that when you clone, especially a purebred dog, you have another purebred dog, and yeah, it's probably got some phenotypic. It probably looks and acts a little bit like the other dog, but it's a very different dog because it's raised differently. And, we all know that longevity, interestingly enough, is, they keep whittling down the number that genetics plays in the actual length of quality of life. And I'm reading now it's somewhere around 8 to 12% is influenced by the genes you were born with. Okay. So in that case, how much are you getting with cloning? I'm sure you're getting tired of this question, but I have to ask you because you're the expert on hand. How much is AI helping us in this goal of maximizing or optimizing the lifespan and health span of dogs?
So I think it's still like really, really early, but I think you're beginning to see some like the way that I kind of describe it is kind of like these like almost like artifacts or these kind of like jagged pieces where you're like, like there's something interesting there. And I think more broadly, that's what we're experiencing a lot of in society right now, where you're seeing like the growth of these models and they're hitting all these crazy benchmarks, but you're like, has my life, day-to-day life kind of changed that much? And then every once in a while you're like, a country song made by AI is like on the Billboard 100, or, this thing happened, or you saw this thing. And so there's just these little kind of like, almost like sprinkles of the future, I think, that you're kind of reacting to. I think we're beginning to see a little bit of this from like a pet's perspective. So maybe like a couple things that I think kind of lay the groundwork for why we're in a really interesting position right now. So the first is, we are increasingly close to being able to unlock a lot of the historical medical information that has been generated by the veterinary profession. So as a specific example, you have, VCA's like renal tech algorithm that was in part influenced and built upon, I think like 100,000 feline records, where they kind of went back and were able to kind of say, okay, this is what happened. This is the algorithm to be able to predict like renal disease.
A product created by a company called Antech, which is the largest diagnostic lab, and arguably in the future, and it tells us whether or not cats are moving towards chronic renal disease.
Yeah, exactly. So you kind of have like these kind of like buckets. So one is, how can we unlock the historical wisdom of the veterinary profession by using AI to basically like read every medical record and tag them and make and sort of really begin to leverage that information, coupled with, with new systems, be in a position where we can better analyze and plug that in. So that's kind of one piece. I think the second part is, even the way that we do research, I think, is going to fundamentally change, right? Like, so much of research is, limited by what humans can do with vast amounts of information to find the right test or find the right experiment to run. And when it comes to veterinary medicine, the budgets are more limited, the sample sizes are smaller. And for a long time, we just didn't even have the fields of specialization to pursue some of these advanced questions. And now what you're getting to is the point where, AI is reading every research paper that's ever been created, predicting the experiments that you should run, and beginning to like optimize like the lab infrastructure to basically run these experiments in the cloud. And you're kind of seeing at every single point in that flow, like massive investment in companies that are specifically around those places. And so practically speaking, this has maybe 2 or 3 different dimensions. One is, I think the research frontier gets expanded massively as we can do things and ask questions and sort of target our efforts in ways that we never found before. The second part is the translation of those advances to your average practitioner, where they're not in this cycle of, okay, I need to like go to a conference, learn about this new thing. And then I think the ultimate pressure that's going to force that condensed timeline of like discovery to action to like change in standard of care is actually pressure from pet owners, because information asymmetry is going to basically go away. Where if I do like a deep research query right now in Gemini or ChatGPT, it's able to pull in a lot of information that if I was to take that information and go to veterinarian, they might know some of it, but they might not know every single detail. And I think there's also this recognition that the amount of information that we're generating is just so far, so much greater than what we can process as humans. So it's not like, are you a smart person or do you have this credential? It's like, look, as the research throughput continues to evolve, as there's more connections to historical data, as we have more information from pet owners directly, it's just impossible. Like, we need to accept the fact that it's impossible for one person to be able to keep tabs on that, especially in the models of care that we've sort of set up and the nature of those relationships. And we can talk more about that in a second, because I think there's some human analogs as well. But I think what ends up emerging is this future where we are able to ask much better questions because of our ability to unlock the value of this historical information. We're in a better position to run those more targeted experiments. We're in a better position to gather more data from more sources, whether it's your pet cameras or your wearable devices or your food bowls as those become online. And then we're in a position to be able to unlock different sorts of care models that frankly are largely incompatible with the way that veterinary care exists today. Like, I think that there will be this huge diversification of models, because if you look at the human space, you can go like get a vaccine at like a walk-in clinic, whatever, or you can pay $25,000 for a year-round concierge service that does every single test, and you have a team of doctors. And the experience and cost and results that you get from one are not the other. But when you look at veterinary medicine, we're almost expected to slam those both together. And it's like,
Absolutely.
Clearly that's not going to work.
And most people pick the veterinary practice that they go to based on location and proximity and ease of use. Sometimes with a close second to that's where my friends and neighbors tell me to go, which of course those are convoluted. So I heard two things going on there, and I want to just make sure I'm getting them straight. One is the premise that AI naturally flows to very complex questions and complicated questions that potentially where it shines is where our brains stop. I grew up, my PhD work was all done with, you get down to one factor. Yeah, well, there's one independent variable that you're going to be testing for. You control for all other factors. Those are all, and that's the thing that you're asking. But the reality is, and was at the time, and we all knew it, life's a lot more complicated than that. And there are oftentimes you can't just come down to one independent variable, and you need to use multiples, and our brains stop being able to function at that. And that's something that naturally AI is much better at. And then I also heard you say that the data sets are ugly and mostly incompatible if it's you and me working on an Excel spreadsheet, but that AI can bring those data together and create larger data sets, which probably can allow us, through just the magic of large numbers, to pull smart things out of this complexity, smart associations and causality events.
Yeah. And I think the other thing too is you look at kind of like the ecosystem around that, right? So even if you wanted to like start a clinical, like how do you source those pets, right? And meet those pet owners where they are. So it's not just about, can we find the right questions and sort of pursue this in the right way? And there's all, and again, back to my kind of like artifact kind of sprinkles, you're seeing this already where, there'll be like an article a week now. It's like a researcher who's been working on something for 2 years. Like the AI found this, that came to a similar conclusion in a matter of days. And I think it's not like, hey, we're replacing that researcher. It's like the throughput of research that you can do expands massively and you can ask smarter and better questions. But I think, it's important to remember like where we are today to show you how rudimentary the current process is. So as an example, like if I'm a pet owner and I go to like a specialist clinic and I get a bunch of tests done, right? Still really difficult to maybe share those records, but the specialist will then like send that record or notify the general practitioner. And what they basically get back is like a massive PDF of a bunch of results and a bunch of findings. And what do they do with that? Well, the veterinarian, who by the way, right now has like 2 minutes between appointments, right? It is not like thoroughly digesting that information. Like it's not even uploaded in a way that's actionable in the practice management systems, right? It's like an attachment of a PDF. And so you think about how many PDFs there are of really important information where you can't even properly use that information to effectively and efficiently kind of personalize the experience for that one pet whose record it is, let alone kind of this broader landscape snapshot of it. And so I think that there's just so much opportunity by solving kind of that workflow problem and that experience for that individual patient, which in my example is just like brief the vet on that information and have their reminders in the right spot. You end up creating a system that's then capable of connecting and networking across multiple different data sets. And then the other thing to recognize is like, that's the data that we have today. So if you're a pet owner and all of a sudden you have a litter box that's weighing your cat and measuring your urine output, or you have a pet camera that's got 24/7 footage of your pet scratching, like that data, which is health data, has no integration points today to both the care systems and the care model. And so we're already at a point, right? We're not even talking about new research. We're talking about your vet's ability to handle your pet's existing medical record, let alone like new research, let alone new data sources. And clearly you're at a point where it's not going to just be shoving more PDFs in that person's head. And so I think what's going to end up happening is that as we look at ways to ingest and work with that information, a byproduct of that is the ability to have more kind of population level insights to be used for different applications and different types of research. And I think that's what's really going to push the frontier forward. And I think at the end of the day, two things are true. people are going to continue to have pets, and they're going to continue to care very deeply about those pets, and they're going to want to understand them more deeply. And so I don't see a world in which all of a sudden there's a headwind that sort of prevents us from exploring more deeply how to prolong and enhance the life of pets, because that in some cases, I think that as the world becomes like more AI-ified or whatever, that's going to be one of the preserving things, that in a world in which there'll be probably 30-40% of people that are like, I don't like the fact that everything's connected to the internet. We're like, I'm going to double down on my dog or my cat because so I think it's just going to be like
there is a purity
foil to
right?
that. Yeah.
I mean, and I think that is just like, I would argue after a day of really intense data crunching and big teleological thinking, there's nothing better than to go out in the backyard and throw something for my dog because she doesn't care, right? So let me throw this premise to you, Adam. Is it also true, all of this complexity and changing the way that that veterinarians can interact with their patients? Is it also true that we are changing fundamentally the way that pet parents can interact with the health of their pets in such a way that advocacy becomes much more relevant? So, for instance, I happen to love this Cavalier King Charles Spaniel. I know that I've heard that Cavalier King Charles Spaniels, my internet told me, maybe you should think about heart disease in your Cavalier King Charles Spaniel. So then I become, through the help of AI, and yes, there's still hallucinations, but they're getting better, as you have pointed out many times. They're getting better a lot faster than people are giving them credit for getting better. I can become at least conversant in mitral valve disease in dogs without ever having to go to vet school. That doesn't mean I should be able to start doing open heart surgery on my dog, but at least I can help the veterinarian guide to and fast forward those conversations with the professionals that need it.
Yes, 100%. Because you sort of look and you say, okay, what's happened over the past 10 years? And I think over the past 10 years, you've seen this kind of, I would argue kind of fragmentation, some would argue maybe expansion in the number and diversity of stakeholders that have a vested interest and a sense of trust and authority when it comes to your pet's health, right? To your point, breeder communities or new genetic tests or just, really passionate pet owners who do resolve, the nutrition relationship has become really complex where people buy products, people are getting vet advice now when they're, on online stores. So the profession has really struggled with this because on one end, you're like, this is great that people are like, there's more pets and they care more about them to ask these questions and they're spending more money. But I don't necessarily like the diversity of sources and perspectives and maybe authority that has been created. And I just think like, you ain't seen nothing yet, right? Because here's the reality. People care deeply about their dogs, and AI is going to get increasingly better at helping you navigate and support you for the things that you deeply care about. And it's not going to be this like reactive thing where I have to ask it, hey, my dog's struggling. The AI is going to know that I love my dog. Like ChatGPT, when I turn on my video mode, it knows my dog Walter. It knows a lot about Walter, actually, just from the conversations that I've had with it about a bunch of things about my life, because it turns out pet owners talk about their pets. And so you start to get this situation where the friction to accessing services and products and information just drops really significantly. And if you don't have a ability to kind of play in that environment, or you've created so many barriers from a cost, access, connectivity perspective that it makes it almost impossible for pet owners to navigate, you're in a lot of trouble. And so maybe to illustrate this with an example, people know, maybe listeners to this podcast, who they know what it looks like for it to be difficult to book an appointment, right? So you think about like, what's the worst appointment you've ever booked? Well, it's not available online and I have to call them and they don't answer the phone and they ask me a bunch of stupid questions that they already have and they don't give me price. But then you zoom out, you're like, okay, well now when I search in ChatGPT and I'm talking about like a lamp, it just gives me a link to buy the perfect lamp, right? Like I'm not going to the site anymore, whatever. And so when you apply it to pet care, if you're a veterinary practice or you have a model of care that as people are discovering that information, they have no way to easily interact with your product or services, you're just done. Because what's going to happen is if I have two clinics and I'm searching ChatGPT and one's like, hey, I can tell that you're asking about this piece of information. I got the best vet cardiologist and here's a one-click thing to book that appointment. I'm going to transfer your records. Or here's this other clinic that I kind of found like a Google search result and they don't offer, the ability to book online or fill your medication or it's like you're never going to call. Because increasingly the AI is just going to handle those interactions. And so I do think there is a very real possibility that the puzzle piece that we've developed for veterinary medicine is not able to integrate fully into where these conversations are happening, where people are making their decisions, how they're discovering information. And I think it's really important in the same way that so much, back to the Pet Connect example, the research showed when the internet was coming, like we weren't participating in a really meaningful way. There is a very large risk that that piece gets filled by a bunch of other services and products. Now, remember, some of those are going to be telemedicine services that employ veterinarians or run by veterinarians, et cetera. So it's not like it's a binary black and white thing. But I think the existing care model is really challenged to be that puzzle piece for that future. And what will fill it will be a whole explosion of different care models that will look really interesting to see how they work together. So as an example, you purchase your cat's litter box and then for $5 more a month, you have this like feline monitoring service, kind of like the security cameras. And like, look, I can sell you the camera, but if you want 24/7 monitoring with a human that's able to respond, it's an additional service. And so what I get really interested in is the surface area for veterinary medicine to interact with pet owners expands greatly, but it's based on kind of meeting owners where they are with a shared understanding and being able to use the full extent of the pet context that the pet owner is providing.
Yeah, I think this is where we come down to what do pet parents who are motivated, progressive thinking, want to actually become the advocates. I think about the human child analogy. Of course, I care that all boys in second grade get good educations. Of course, I care about that. I really care about my son. My kid needs to have a good education in the second grade. And so I'm going to be much more engaged in where is he learning, which techniques seem to resonate easier with him. I think there's a similar thing here with pets. And we are now not just getting the tools to expand our understanding of pet health, but also to become advocates for our own pets.
But I think to your point, like the other thing that's kind of challenging is that I haven't seen any data that really describes the size of this currently, but like call it the gray veterinary market. And what I mean by that is every veterinarian knows the experience, has gotten the phone call or the text from a family member where they're asking questions or providing services. And so I think the reality is for a long time, the care model has been kind of incompatible or less compatible than we would have liked. And it's just frankly like the goodwill of veterinary friends who are like, I'm going to help this person out because clearly, to your point about I can ask all these questions and get an answer about mitral valve disease, there's something really, really important about that trusted relationship. And I think that the challenge is, I think even in a world in which pet owners have all the answers themselves, they will still double down on those trusted relationships. But if you are on the other end, creating a veterinary model that is eroding that trust because you are not really creating it and cultivating it in those interactions. You've jacked up your prices. The vets have turned over. You have less time with those people. You're not giving them support. You're like, you've turned this relationship into a transactional one, which makes it far more susceptible for me to substitute it with some of these other alternatives versus on the other end, you're like, I'm still going to go to Dr. whatever, because I know that he has my best interest at heart. Like, I think that is a very resilient bond in a world in which people will have more options. We'll see how resilient, but my concern is that because of a bunch of actions and decisions and just trends in the profession, we have traded that trust for kind of transactional gain or optimizing for transactional relationships. And I think that leaves you very susceptible to some of these emerging technologies.
Yeah, I think the reason I get excited about this conversation, Adam, and I think the reason I remain optimistic. Nobody got into veterinary medicine for the glory, for the smell, or for the riches. We got into it because we love animals and we wanted to be healers of those animals. But allow that to come through as opposed to the transactional stuff, as you very rightfully point out. Hey, before we let the whole conversation get away into the veterinary profession, I did want to ask you about digital twins, because I think that that's a really interesting area. Could you just explain, what do you think about when you think about a digital twin? How far are we? What do you need in order to have the most basic version of such a thing?
Yeah, I guess the way that I think about that, and certainly this is, there's others who know this more deeply, but is the ability to using as many kind of data points as you can, whether it's additional diagnostics, et cetera, to basically create this representation of the health and snapshot of you as a person or your pet. And I think that there are different ways that can manifest, as we'll talk about in a second. But I think it's really interesting because, you see this all the time in the human health space. It's okay, once we have that, we're gonna show you different scenarios. What happens if you continue on the behaviors that you have? What happens if you continue to smoke like this, drink like this, eat a cookie like this? This is what you look like. And it helps people kind of visualize, connect their kind of current state to their future state and understand how their behaviors manifest over time. And I think that's really important because, as you were talking about, what actually impacts our health, there's a lot of things that are in our control, but I think a lot of them require kind of longer term, consistent changes, as opposed to, okay, I was really unhealthy, and then all of a sudden the next day, I fasted for.
Right. I'm 67 years old. Someone finally scared me straight. I'm going to change everything now. Well,
exactly.
Probably too late.
So I think it's a really interesting approach to try to help to manifest and drive the behavior changes that ultimately are needed to get to that point. And maybe in some cases, scare people into really recognizing their risks, right? And so there are different ways that could manufacture in the pet space, right? So I think one of the interesting things is that, from a pet perspective, Tamagotchis and those sorts of avatars have always been really appealing to people, right? And so you can imagine, what if that was my actual pet? And what does that experience look like? What is the right way to deliver it? And do you sort of do you inject some of the health conversations and behaviors in more of a social and gamified way? You look at things like pet cubes and things of that nature. In some ways, that connection virtually to your dog, where it's feed them here, play with them there. How different is that than, what people used to do with Tamagotchis? I think from a health perspective, this is where, every pet owner, or most pet owners, but it's kind of like driving. People always believe that they're in the better half. My pet is, there's fatter pets, there's worse off pets, there's dental disease, whatever. And veterinarians have always struggled with that because we have much of a better, I think, understanding of where your pet sits relative to other pets. We know, hey, if your golden retriever's 85 pounds and this on the body condition score, you might say they're a little chubby today. We're no, they're going to die earlier, right? So you're looking and you're is there a way through these technologies to help, again, with that information asymmetry, but take what can be interpreted as emotionally driven, maybe subjective conversations, things that veterinarians themselves are not always great at communicating, right? It's one thing to know what you should do, but at the end of the day, if you're a veterinarian who is not willing to have that conversation, or the pet owner is not kind of in a position to hear it, there's only, you can talk to them about obesity, but are you really taking them through what it means, why it's important, the risks, the data, et cetera? Versus in that kind of digital twin scenario, you can supplement or augment the veterinary relationship with more objective conversations and scenarios that people can begin to explore. So all of a sudden, it's not like your veterinarian having this tough conversation saying your pet is in the top 10% for obese golden retrievers. It's this system, and it's helping you discover and understand this. And so if you want to change and augment their diet or their behavior, et cetera, and then is it a jumping off point to be able to trigger those actions? So you can imagine, and maybe in this first version of these digital twins, it's your pet's overweight. This is what it's going to look like. They're going to live, 2 years shorter than if you made these changes. This is what you should feed them. But if the next step is, hey, do you want me to update their feeding regimen that we have automatically for their automated feeder? Click here to apply that program. Or, we have a network of dog walkers. We recommend it goes to 2.5 times, or we recommend this supplement. There's so many kind of, I would say, non-medical or non-prescription ways to begin to influence that behavior and then create that feedback loop. Because remember, some of these changes will take over time. So it's not just showing that digital twin, but how do you start to foster this relationship and engagement where pet owners see and feel the benefits of being a good pet owner at the time when maybe their pet is not necessarily showing, they don't lose 10 pounds overnight, right? And so you sort of look and you're like, okay, what becomes like the Weight Watchers plus digital twin plus connected devices plus your doctor for pet owners? And I don't know, but I would say that I think having this representation of what your pets are and their health in a way that's much more digestible, much more adaptable to you, can be influenced by other data sources, you can interrogate and go as deep as you want, ends up being like a really important kind of piece of tissue that connects you to veterinarians. Because then if veterinarians are like, look, let's go back to this plan, it's one of the reasons that when you see like a lot of these coaches for different aspects of your life, it's like, okay, the first job is we're gonna develop a plan, we're gonna see what's good for you, and then we're gonna revisit that in a way that helps us, as opposed to like, it's my opinion versus your opinion. It's like, no, this is what we agreed it was important. And so I think that kind of plays in a bunch of aspects, but I can imagine that becoming increasingly critical for people, and then layering on those scenarios and then them contributing data to, and then more importantly, connecting it to actions that they have much more control over.
Yeah. I also don't know if this needs to be owned by the veterinary profession. I think this could also just be standing third party and really helping.
Yes.
Hey, doc, this is what I'm learning about my pet. I need to do this. She's got osteoarthritis, but I also know she needs to lose weight. Can you help me through this with both prescription drugs, potentially new treatments like, regenerative medicine and those kinds of things? And what do you think about this change? And then we put all that in real time. And then you're like, oh, 6 months from now, you can see that she's going to be in a much healthier space. I agree with you. I think there is a lot of polarization and vilification that happens in medicine, particularly when you're talking about the medicine related to something that is dependent on you. So whether that's your child in human world or your pet, I'm not making bad choices for myself. I can choose I can choose to have that second glass of wine if I want to. But if I'm choosing that for my pet, there's a whole different level of guilt and association that goes with that. And so if you use the third party to say, look, you're doing fine right now. However, pick an example, you're feeding her 100% ultra processed food. It's kibble, it's quality kibble, but it's ultra processed. And maybe if you just top dress with green beans and you substitute 10% of her diet with something that's unprocessed, this is what we can predict her to be better. That's really interesting. That's a different way of thinking about digital twins.
The other thing too that's probably worth noting is like there's two other aspects I think like end up supporting this. So one is that does every veterinarian become like a free agent? And it turns out in those models that when I want to go further, I end up developing relationships with individual veterinarians for different aspects of my pet's health, as opposed to this like clinic relationship. And does that allow for people to have like increased specialization, more autonomy, et cetera? And I think you already kind of saw this a little bit with telemedicine. And so the rise of some of those platforms where they kind of have now multiple jobs. But this just, again, it's about creating like more opportunities in that surface area for that veterinary connection where you can go much, much more deeper. So that's one piece. The second part is, so much of the relationship that people have with their pets ends up being kind of like an emotional positive benefit. And so you kind of get this double whammy where like, yes, I'm going to obviously do my best in order to improve the physical health of my pet and keep them healthy. But if, this is an overly simplistic analogy, but it's like, okay, well, maybe for like every pound that my dog's losing, like I'm 5 points happier, right? Like and so you sort of have a situation where, people's emotional response to these models might be that they feel more close to their pet. They feel like it's giving them purpose and meaning, and giving them a good, allowing some kind of like good, energy, whatever, to flow. But the emotional benefits end up creating this, feedback loop where there's even a deeper relationship. They feel more positive towards pets. I think that's really interesting as well. In particular, when you look at like the different, models for paying for care, like, whether it's employer benefits and insurance, like you end up having this ecosystem that, starts to support and maybe invest in some of those capabilities. So, I mean, I think it's going to be really, really interesting to see where it all shakes out. It's going to look different.
Well, we like to end the podcast with the same kind of question every time. If there was a pet parent who, like, some of the points in this conversation really just resonated with them and they'd like to learn more, what are a couple of pieces of media that you would point them to?
Yeah. So we can put this in the show notes. I mentioned this guy, Hanu. He actually did a TEDx talk that I've probably listened to like 3 or 4 times. And it's about like the complexity of systems. And it's just fascinating because it helps to kind of maybe explain some of these concepts at more of an abstract level. Another thing that I'm always really passionate about is like the building component of it. So there's a guy, his name's Lenny. He was a former like Airbnb product manager, but he's done like a lot of like, how do you like build for this future and much more of like, some of the AI stuff and pieces like that. So that's those are probably 2 that kind of come up quite a bit for me. And the last thing I might share is that there's this tool I've been using recently called Sublime. And what Sublime is it's kind of this like, interesting kind of social network where as you kind of curate and find different things online, it helps you kind of discover and almost like engineered serendipity online, which is really quite powerful. So it always for me is like a very thought-provoking, happy, sort of like more calm corner of the internet.
Well, man, if we can find uplifting, happy, and informative,
exactly.
and generally positive areas of the internet, we should post those far and wide. Well, Adam, this has been an absolute joy talking with you, as it always is. We'll talk more about this one as time goes on.
Cheers. Thanks.